Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. Unleashed is produced by Umbrex, which connects you with the world's top independent management consultants. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm here today with Matt McDonald, who is a partner at Hamilton Place Strategies, a public policy and communications firm. And Matt was just named one of the 38 power players of consulting by Business Insider. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm not the only power player on this podcast, though, I should note.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I was named as one as well, which was really cool. Matt, first of all, I'm kind of from a management consulting background. You're a McKinsey alum as well. You have that background as well, but I am really not that familiar with the world of public policy consulting and even what that is. So give us an overview of what that term even means.
Yeah, sure. Well, when I think for a lot of companies, when they reach a certain size, and certainly we're seeing this with a lot of companies today, is that I forget what's the joking phrase is that you may not care about government, but government cares about you. Is that there is an element of you get to a certain size and you are of interest to kind of the government, the regulators, that sort of thing. And so, at some point, companies have to engage with government entities. And part of what we try to do is work with both the government side of things and the debates that go on in Washington and companies themselves to really shape public policy, legislation, regulation that would be the best outcomes for everybody involved. That's kind of the basic goals of what we do.
Okay. And give me an example of what that means in practice, and maybe you could differentiate it for me from what, say, a lobbying firm does, or if there's an overlap, or if it's the same, or if it's very distinct.
Yeah, there's examples of the types of work that we do. Right now we're working on work around the antitrust debate around big tech. So lots of as an example, right now, there's in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, there's lots of discussions in Washington among certain circles about putting a moratorium on M&A transactions, right? And that's part of a broad kind of antitrust scrutiny that's been going on for some years in Washington. Part of the work that we would do is, in the context of tech competition, illustrate kind of what's happening in that space and how dynamic it is. In the context of M&A, we'd be talking to people in DC about the value of that, especially in a volatile time, to both preserving businesses and preserving jobs and that sort of thing going forward. The distinction, I would say the distinction on lobbying is an interesting one where in Washington, firms that do lobbying have to formally register to go in and talk to members of Congress and or regulators and that sort of thing. For us and the work that we do, we're typically we do work with lobbyists and help them help with their research or help craft their arguments, or we'll work with trade associations in Washington. We'll work with lots of reporters who are trying to explain this stuff to the broad public and to DC itself. There's a little bit of a line drawn of kind of whether you go in and are the person that talks to a member of Congress, say. A lot of those people are former aides to people on Capitol Hill and that sort of thing. So there's a little bit of relationship that drives that, as opposed to kind of on our side of things, it tends to be more substance driven around a particular argument or debate and the research that goes into that and how you talk about that with the media or with other players in DC, that sort of thing.
Okay. So I've read some places that while we think, or at least from the popular press, of lobbyists as being these kind of backslappers who, just mainly are giving a lot of, campaign contributions or just kind of going out golfing or inviting Congress people to some resort, that really a lot of their power actually comes from being able to provide information and arguments that are coherent, or even kind of drafting legislation, because staff is so shorthanded, particularly at the state level, that and I think this was maybe in the book State Capture, this argument about
Yeah.
ALEC, that it's not so much about that you're giving them contributions or being their friend, but it's you're helping them kind of do their job by giving them data, arguments, graphs, talking
Yeah.
points.
So this is interesting. There's a lot to unpack on this. So I would say, it is true that over time, lobbying in particular has moved from what you might call access or relationship driven lobbying more to expertise driven lobbying, right? Part of the work that we think about in general is how do you how do you get the information that is most important to everyone making a good decision for kind of the collective benefit of the country? How do you get that information in front of the people who are making those decisions, right? That's one way to think about it. The other half of what you're talking about, of kind of the staff side and the resources that exist there, that's developed in interesting ways over the past couple of decades. There's aspects, and there's been some discussion in DC over a few years on this, of like some of the reforms that were kind of put forward as good government reforms have actually had the result of gutting some of the expertise that exists in government. So if you ever look at, for example, term limits, which was, I don't know, term limits was probably a hot thing in the 90s. I don't hear people talking about it as much anymore, but term limits, I worked for Governor Schwarzenegger in California for a while, right? And term limits are a big thing in California, and part of what has resulted in that is that people actually aren't in office long enough to really learn the ropes or be expert in the types of things that they're expected to do. And what you point out is that the lobbying industry helps fill that void of expertise in government. So it's an interesting thing where you have this good government impetus of, hey, we should really like mix it up a little bit so that there are different people and different perspectives representing us, actually results in kind of like, well, nobody's representing you after the fact because they're not even there long enough to really learn the ropes, which is kind of, it's backwards. But there's sometimes I feel like I am generally in the business of unintended consequences, right? I mean, it does have this question of like, oftentimes like the worst policy decisions I see are ones where there's a free lunch, or people think there's a free lunch and they don't even know the choice that they're making, right? Because there's always a choice. There's always some sort of trade-off, and that's what's often not clear to people.
So walk me through how an engagement actually works for a public policy firm like yours, like Hamilton Place Strategies. I mean, I don't know if you could, what you can share with the one you mentioned, the antitrust debates, but I'd like to hear kind of what would the kind of statement of work look like, and then what does your firm actually do? What's the deliverable? Is it content that then you produce as white papers, or is it then something that the tech industry? So just walk me through it and engagements, just sort of how that world works.
Yeah, absolutely. So typically, you've got kind of one of two scenarios, right? Is that we're either hired on a retainer basis as a firm to help a client with typically research or communications support, right? And that may be around a particular issue, or it may be for general support. There are companies that are large enough where they have a specific kind of global head of public policy role, right? And a lot of our contracts flow through that, or a chief communications officer, or sometimes the marketing functions of different companies, right? And then the way that the work typically unfolds is that, I would say that there's a few different pieces to it, but typically you're talking about some portion of research work. So going and doing a deep dive on the issue and really understanding it backwards and forwards. A lot of times that will result in kind of the development of a research book that outlines all the details of the different arguments and the points that people make and the data and that sort of thing. Sometimes that will get used for creating content that may result in white papers, or may inform websites or social media posts or that sort of thing. And then and then on the back end, there's an element of like, okay, here is the information that we've collected. Here is how to understand this situation. How do we get it in front of the people who need this information to make better informed decisions, right? And that can take multiple forms. And we typically try to be, the way that we think about it is that there's a little bit of, we try to be a little bit platform agnostic on how we approach that. But a lot of the times you're talking about, talking to reporters, placing stories in the media, developing out content on websites, social media, kind of all the different ways that people talk about public policy in Washington. We try to be there with the information that's relevant for those debates.
Okay. I'm curious about the point about kind of placing stories in the media and talking to reporters.
Yeah.
When you read the newspaper, mm-hmm. what are some signs to you that a story has been kind of placed there by a firm like yours? Are there some sort of telltale signs that that help okay, that was kind of planted there somehow, or introduced to that reporter by a firm, just the way it's written with the references and the data and so forth?
Well, it's not, if it's a straight news story, it's not usually that clean. I would say that it's funny because reading the news as deeply as I do and paying attention to it, you kind of get a sense for where stories go and how they evolve over time. And when you're reading a story, I think that the thing that after you work in this industry professionally, the thing that you really pay attention to is the people that are in the story, right? I am frequently more interested in the byline than I am in the title. And I am frequently more interested in the sources that are quoted than I am the facts in the story, right? Because really what you're seeing when you read coverage of different public debates in Washington is that you're reading the public version of lots of private conversations that happen every day in Washington. That's really what you're seeing, right? So if you look through and read kind of who is saying what about what and what the quotes are, and then which quotes aren't attributed to people, you can get a sense for where the debate or argument is going on different things. That's how I actually read the news.
Now, I imagine you mentioned sort of the antitrust for tech. That's obviously this massive story. But yeah. I'm curious, there's only so many room for so many stories on the front pages, and I imagine that there's like, maybe it's like the iceberg in the Titanic, that so many of these policy things would be really obscure, very important to some company or some industry association, but just would never be in the news. Do you work on those sorts of issues that are just kind of like, you never even hear about it if you read the New York Times, but maybe it's important to the milk industry or the the corrugated industry or something.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of stuff that crops up like that. I would say that, for us, what you'll see typically in Washington around those types of issues that are fairly niche is that a lot of those industries rely on their trade association as their voice in Washington on a specific set of issues, right? We typically come in on issues that are much more consequential, where they really need serious help, and it's under scrutiny, right? The shorthand for that I think about with our work in our firm is that, we basically work on very complex issues that have pretty high public exposure. Okay. And so that's kind of the zone that we get in. So if it's kind of debates around, like, the Northeastern Milk Compact and how that, what the trade relations with Canada, how that implies, that theoretically that's work that we could do, but typically, people are relying on their trade associations for that sets of stuff. Like, I'll give you an example of an issue that we've been working on recently that's cropped up in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, is that there's a big debate brewing around business interruption insurance for small businesses and the fact that it doesn't cover pandemics. That's a place where we're working on that debate with insurers to kind of explain what the policies do and do not cover, and how government can help small businesses, even though no one's typically bought policies that cover pandemics. So you look at something like that, and that is a hundreds of billions of dollars at stake and in need for small businesses across the country. So that's typically kind of the level of work that we end up getting involved in.
Okay, that helpful. Um, so, how does this work actually get done? And maybe
Yeah.
let me rephrase that. What or start in a different place. Does your firm, or is this something that other firms would do, just sort of monitor policy discussions at the local, state, and federal level for a company? You mentioned earlier some firms might have a global head of policy, but
Mm-hmm.
in order to see it, even know what's going on, they I'm curious if there's firms that sort of do that monitoring of, okay, there's bills under discussion in Nebraska and California, New York City, and number one, just to monitor, and number two, even to figure out, okay, what should our position be? For our company, how does that impact us? Some things might be super obvious, but other things, it might be unclear. Like, if you're representing Google, like what side of this should Google be on?
Yeah.
So could you
Yeah.
talk about
So
that a little bit?
yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of dimensions to that. So there's definitely a whole industry around monitoring legislation and regulation. Um, it's interesting. A lot of the government functions on that are online, but it does kind of remind me of a little bit of like Bloomberg, and Bloomberg operates in the company, not the guy, operates in this space where of tracking legislation. So you have both lobbyists tracking legislation proper. You have a bunch of technical tools that are keeping track of how some of these things are moving through. You have kind of media monitoring, a host of tools and people who do that. And then the other actually really fascinating piece is social media. Twitter in particular is just a very heavily trafficked site for both kind of political policymakers and reporters. That's a heavy place where a lot of these conversations go, and on some level that's a super easy thing to monitor and target, because you can create APIs that alert you to different positions that people are taking or what's going on. So and one of the things that we've developed over the past several years is kind of media monitoring and analytics tools to get a sense for the share of voice on any particular topic, and how that's moving over time, and how people should be, and how people should be thinking about it. You raised the question of, okay, do we weigh in on this or do we weigh in on that? It's my sense that corporate America has come under, I would say, increased, I don't know, scrutiny, pressure for leadership broadly on public policy debates. With, I would say, with kind of both mixed, with a mixed reaction of whether they want to wade into every last political dynamic. But it does have this quality of, we're living in an era where everything has become political, and leaders across the spectrum find themselves being called on to weigh in on issues that a generation ago would have been left to others. So it's a very interesting dynamic in terms of how politics in Washington are intersecting with the corporate world these days.
All right. So let's get back to my earlier question that I jumped around.
Yeah.
In terms of how one of these engagements actually works, could you bring me into
Mm-hmm.
the guts of it a little bit? And
Yeah.
what are the different phases? How does it work?
Yeah. Well, let me talk. It's interesting. I mean, let me talk a little bit about how kind of our firm is set up and how we approach this type of work. Because it's interesting. I don't know what I've found in recent years. I remember when and I suppose this is dating me, though it's not that long ago. When I first started at McKinsey, Excel had 32,000 lines, right? And I can remember being on client projects where we had to go get Access installed, the database program installed on our machine to do particular analysis on a project, right? And it wasn't a few years later, as it is now, that you can put 1 million lines into Excel, right? And that, to me, that is like an interesting dimension that has happened across technology that consulting uses, right? So So like the technical tools that our team uses to do our job, to do the research, to do that sort of stuff, that's gone. The accessibility of that has gone way down. So we fundamentally run a generalist practice, and what that means is that from a process perspective, the same person on our teams is doing the research into the issue, is then, compiling the research, is using that research to maybe like write an op-ed for a CEO, is pitching and placing that op-ed themselves, is then crafting social media on behalf of the CEO on the back end, and then going in and placing a digital advertising campaign that drives eyeballs to that piece, right? So like that's an example of both the way that the way that our work kind of unfolds, but then also how we approach it itself. We don't really have silos within our organization, which has implications in terms of recruiting and how we think about that. But it really does free us up to think broadly about what the best strategy or tool is to solve a particular client problem.
Wow. But that also means that folks have to be good at a pretty broad range of skills, being able to research, write op-eds, do social media.
It is super difficult. The type of work that our team does is very kind of left brain, right brain, right? You have to have someone who can read and understand research and data, and then also explain it to other people. And there's plenty of people who can do one and the other, but to be able to do both is definitely a challenge. And when we started the firm, that was kind of the premise of like combining kind of the depth and analytical ability with the ability to explain it to the different audiences that you care about. And we saw a white space in the consulting world. You never know whether a white space is white because nobody's thought of it or because they have thought of it and it was just so unappealing that they abandoned it, right? And the challenge that we found, I think we're probably the only consulting firm in Washington that does on-campus recruiting, but the solution to us to be able to kind of crack the code on that and that hurdle has really been to just upgrade the talent and approach the talent and recruiting side from a pretty rigorous perspective, which allows us to get kind of those hybrid people come in. We're typically looking for, when we're doing our undergraduate recruiting, our prototype might be an econ major who also like wrote for the school paper or something like that, Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. So you do on campus both undergrad. You also do like MBAs or grad school.
We don't. It's interesting. We don't do MBA recruiting, and I don't know that we never will. I would say that in general, the price point of the consulting work that we do in DC, I mean, fundamentally, a lot of our work in government broadly is a cost center, right? So it's hard to come into a client and say, hey, you can pay me $1 million to do X and you'll make $5 million on the back end, right? Our conversations are more like, hey, this is our price, and then there's a 1% chance this is going to cost you $1 billion, and maybe a 90% chance it's going to cost you a $500 million, and you can move it this much. I mean, it's just all very nebulous, right? It's not as clean cut as on the revenue side. So we haven't done MBA recruiting in general. We've tried to compete by getting very qualified undergrads. I mean, the interesting thing about DC, I would say, is that it's not hard to compete on that dimension because there aren't many MBAs in Washington at all. I mean, this is a lawyer's town, and so you're generally dealing with for professional degrees. You're generally dealing with lawyers. There's lots of memos. We're one of the only shops in town that really does decks in any meaningful way. So it's just DC is a very culturally different place than kind of the traditional consulting world that I spent time in.
Mm-hmm. So you're producing decks, and then so it sounds like you're doing research. Is that mostly secondary research, or you're out doing interviews of experts, surveys, focus groups, like on-site
Yeah, it's
visits?
yeah, it's a little bit of it's definitely a little bit of all that. I would say that literature review and secondary research and compiling information is definitely core to it. Um, a lot of, but yes, we will do focus groups, we'll do survey work, we'll do original analysis of our own. We an example of the type of analysis that we would do, right? We did back when we were working, we were the firm of record that worked on the too big to fail debate, right? And back in say 2013 or so, and 2014, there was a thread in the debate in Washington that said, "Hey, it's been 5 years since the financial crisis, and the big banks are bigger than they were before," right? As kind of a political shot at the banking industry. Our response to that and the work that we did was to say, okay, that's fine, but like let's take a step back and look at that, right? So one, during the financial crisis, the government literally directed the banks to acquire each other. So, you can say they're bigger, but you can't kind of count against them actions that you were encouraging them to take. One. Two is that the economy just gets bigger. So a bank is going to grow as the economy grows. And then three is that, and so really the way to think about that is market share, not big banks, not necessarily like the size. And then three is that there was actually a legislative response in the Dodd-Frank Act to change the banking sector. So we said, okay, given all that, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the banks and look at their market share by size. So you've got the big banks, you've got the kind of middle market bulge bracket, and then you've got small banks. Look at the banks by size from pre-Dodd-Frank to after Dodd-Frank, and what is the difference? And when we looked and ran that analysis, and that's analysis that that we did, when we ran that analysis, what you found is that the big banks lost market share, the small banks lost market share, and the middle banks grew market share. And that's what you would expect based on the legislation. You have small banks that struggle to deal with the increase in the regulation. The regulation included penalties for the very largest banks. And so the middle banks were the ones that kind of gained market share as a result of that. So, and what we did with that analysis then is to take, okay, go talk to reporters or policy professionals in Washington and say, hey, I know you're hearing this political talking point, but here's the substance of what's actually happening and how to understand it, right? And when you go and you have the actual facts and you can have those conversations, that's when you really can change minds and have people understand what is going on.
To what degree do you find that facts actually matter in changing the minds of legislators? Just sort of as a outside citizen observer of that whole world, it seems like facts hardly matter anymore. That one party or the other will take a position and then they'll defend it kind of regardless of evidence.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some issues that are just not that partisan where you can, but affect people with facts. But I'd love to hear your thoughts around that.
Well, part of how I would think about it, I mean, the analogy of like the duck swimming along the pond where the feet are going like wild and above it's smooth.
Sure.
We have an upside down duck structure in Washington. At the top, things are going crazy and arms are flailing, but there's still real substance and real debates going on real issues underneath the fact and underneath kind of the circus. And it's weird because you have this element of even though on the outside these debates seem crazier than ever, the reality is that underneath that, because it's such a distraction, there's actually a lot of policy getting made and changed in ways that that are kind of crazy to understand if you actually look at them. So I don't know. It's that's how I think about it. Is that what you see is that beneath the radar is that facts do actually matter in those debates that people are having, and both with kind of the observers of the political process, with the politicians themselves, and then with reporters, all these kind of different players who are interacting. I would say generally that, you know, they generally don't want to be thought an idiot, right? So there is an aspect, and there's certainly plenty of politicians in particular who derive power and influence from kind of the circus atmosphere that they generate around themselves, and they kind of welcome that scrutiny. But for most of them, they want to at least understand the things that they're talking about. um, and if they have the sense that they are out of their depth, um, they'll do their homework. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're gonna change their position, or they're gonna always kind of flip sides of like, oh, I've seen the light, this is the right answer. um, but they will modify their previous position based on a deeper understanding of whatever the complexities or the issue are at hand.
Yeah. I mean, there's some issues that just sort of the big name issues that, um, pro-choice, pro-life
Mm-hmm.
things that are, just
Yes.
so very, very partisan. But then do you find in this policy world that there's some issues that are not really that partisan? Like you couldn't, looking at it, you wouldn't necessarily predict Republican, Democrat, where they're going to be on it. Maybe it matters more what part of the country they're from or what kind of constituents they have. That it's not so much of a party line thing, but it's more just like you couldn't.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I mean, and we actually don't, we don't work on political campaigns. We don't work on social policy issues. We, for us as a firm, we, because we do analytical work, we center on, knowable issues where you can go do the research, and you'll have a perspective, but you can kind of come to a base set of facts around why you have that perspective, as opposed to kind of a values driven argument where, it's not quite as informed by a fact pattern. It's just kind of your orientation or how you think about the world. But I would say that there are issues like that. They just, they kind of don't get a lot of attention, right? That's not, people agreeing isn't news. Um, so so while some of these things can move ahead, like you're seeing it right now with um, the coronavirus response, things like the PPP. I think that there's like a general agreement in Congress that needs to be changed, and they need to increase flexibility. That was kind of designed thinking that the pandemic was going to be a 2 month shutdown exercise, and now that it's not, everybody's kind of like, okay, we get it. This needs to add flexibility for small businesses around the country. I just got off watching a committee hearing on the business interruption insurance that we just talked about, and like there was broad agreement both on the Republican side, on the Democratic side, that we can't retroactively change insurance contracts, right? Everybody kind of agreed and understood that would be completely destabilizing to our system of law and the insurance industry broadly. So there are spaces like that people kind of come together and agree. It's just that's never what is going to lead the news. What's going to lead the news is the conflict.
Yeah, no, that's really insightful. So it's almost the design of the system is things where there's, real debate or actually kind of agreement on the facts. Those are things that you don't hear about.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I
uh,
mean, I think that there are kind of I would say that, especially in the current moment, with so much craziness around politics generally, is that there's a real opportunity to build agreement and substantive progress on different issues, quietly and behind the scenes, because no one politically profits from blowing up things that will be quiet victories. There's not that's an interesting dynamic of the moment that we're in as a result.
Tell me, so you're right in the thick of it. Tell me a little bit of perspective of, what you see going on right now with some of the, coronavirus impact. And, you mentioned that you're working on the insurance issue. Is your firm working on any other issues you can talk about? Love to get your perspective on just how the pandemic is, what's going on in Washington.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say that I think back to um, March. Our firm started working remotely a little bit early, which was helpful. March and and candidly, a lot of April to me for our clients were actually a lot of less like on the policy side, but more on the employee and personnel and that side of things of how do we adapt to this new environment? How do we communicate to our employees? How do we keep them safe? What does the liability look like on the back end of some of this stuff? Um, the CARES Act, which is the vehicle for both small business lending and then some of like airplane bailouts and that sort of thing, that happened remarkably quickly. I mean, that is perhaps the fastest I've ever seen Congress move. Now we're kind of entering, and there was it's when you roll back at the time, people were thinking, okay, this is an exercise of weeks, maybe months, but not beyond that, right? and and now I think that and then there was there's a second round that kind of re-upped some of the funding for those programs. I think that now that people are processing that, okay, the economy is slowly opening back up, but the impact of this is going to last longer. I think people are thinking through the policy implications for that now, and I think it's going to take a while, right, to both figure out. It is definitely hitting a moving target because the economic side of it is changing as we go, and candidly the healthcare side of it is changing as we go too. I look at kind of the different guidance that has happened over the past several months, and it kind of reminds me of the financial crisis for Wall Street, right? The financial crisis was this moment where it's like, oh, the guys that we thought knew everything and what was going on actually didn't know what was going on and didn't really know anything, right? And it has that quality for the public health apparatus at the current moment too. You don't need masks now. You do need masks. We had tons of conversations about ventilators. Now we don't talk about ventilators anymore. There's tons of ventilators to be had. It's just this kind of careening response, um, and I think that that's caused from a policy response of how do we support people, how do we support the economy, how do we support businesses, is that's also been careening because it's all predicated on reopening the economy and what you can do. So the way that I see it right now in Washington is that I'm starting to see, as the response has settled and we're in kind of this moment where, okay, we're starting to open up. We don't know exactly what the impact is going to be on the economy or on jobs or any of those sorts of things, but we know that this is going to be we're going to have to look at this recovery over a period of time, and we need programs that are going to sustain people. I think there's starting to be more creative thinking around what those could look like going forward. I mean, it is a fascinating time to see all of this hit at once, and it's amazing the degree to which some of the tools that exist in public policy are not well suited to the moment. The GDP numbers appear for the initial forecast for the quarter appears like 3 months after the quarter ends.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then jobs data is like, we had what was it, the report at the beginning of May for April, days before that report, the jobs data to survey that, to get the unemployment rate, that survey goes into the field the week of the 12th of the month, right? So like even by the time that data came out, it was 3 weeks old, and 15 million people had claimed unemployment benefits just between when that survey was in the field and when the number was released. So you have this kind of double effect of not really knowing what the health situation looks like, and then you add to that all the economic indicators are not built for the moment, and it's just a very difficult and complex time to make policy in Washington.
What other kind of issues are being discussed that are a little bit under the radar. So things like this, business continuity insurance that are really important to some industries that aren't getting kind of front page attention perhaps, but are big issues that our Congress is working on.
Yeah, I mean, another issue that we're working on that is getting front page attention is travel. We work with airports and think through some of those dimensions. I think that it'll be interesting to see how some of our transportation infrastructure becomes in part healthcare infrastructure. What does that look like? I ride the Amtrak to New York a lot, and it's kind of fascinating that there's not that's a place where there's not heavy security screening. But across all these things, there's definitely not health screening either. So what does that mean for the mobility of our country? What does that mean for business? Related to that, I think a lot of people are thinking about, remote work and real estate and that sort of thing. There was a period of time at the front end of this crisis where, again, the people who kind of don't think about choices in policy were saying, well, people just shouldn't have to pay rent for 3 months. And then there were other people who are like, well, how are the landlords going to pay their people, and how are they going to pay their mortgage? Well, they shouldn't have to pay their mortgage. Okay, well, what about the retirees who are invested in mortgage-backed securities? The economy is a circle, right. And a lot of people in Washington don't view the world that way, or don't really understand that fact. So you had this kind of buck passing exercise at the front end, and I think that there was enough kind of knowledge under the surface, even while you're seeing some crazy opinions at the top, to say okay, that's not going to work. But real estate is going to be fascinating going forward too, right? You're seeing the banks in New York thinking about how they can have suburban offices, right? Restaurants that are now can have half the table seatings. How do you make that business is all predicated on table turnover and volume? How do you even make that business viable or work, right? And then and then you have kind of commercial real estate too, where, okay, what does this look like? Do people have do you have half the people in your office? How do you deal with that? Do you need more office space? Do you have mandatory remote work? What does mandatory remote work look like? What does that look like for transportation infrastructure? The metro here in DC, or the subway in New York, those are all budgeted with high capital investment costs. And then, you cut, if we're going to have a sustained period where ridership is going to be half, well, that's a huge impact on revenues. Likewise, you get to things like the state response to this. I mean, a big debate going on right now is should states get bailed out based on response and need around coronavirus, and what does that imply about the problems of budget management at the state level, and whether states that haven't done a great job of that should get bailed out at this time, and kind of the incentives around that, which is a debate, for fans of Hamilton. They'll be familiar that is a debate literally dating back to the beginning of the Republic, of whether states should get bailed out on this stuff. So the cascade of policy decisions and implications are going to last for years on this entire exercise.
How does the work that a firm like yours does, how is that different from these think tanks like the Cato or Brookings or other sort of think tanks?
Yeah. Well, a lot of those think tanks have particular missions, particular perspectives. They're not, in some level, they're not. A lot of them have corporate sponsors in one frame or another, but they're really more they're almost like shadow universities. Have you ever heard of what is it? At Princeton has I think it's their School for Advanced Studies. Are you familiar with that?
I've heard of it.
It's like this. It's this school within the university that has no students, right? So I had a when I was at MIT for my MBA, I had a professor who had spent time at the School for Advanced Studies, and he was like, it was amazing. It was like a picnic without the ants, right? Because for people who go into that profession, all they want to do is research, and on some level is that if you think about like the timeline of knowledge creation, right, is that in consulting, I think one of the things that a lot of people who have statistical backgrounds have to get over when they get into consulting is that, like, look, yes, the perfect answer is out there, but we need the answer that's available in a month, right? So part of how I think about us related to think tanks is that they have a much longer time horizon on the types of research that they do and the way that they inform debates in DC. They're thinking about things in a much bigger picture. We're typically working on decisions that need to be made in the next month, and how do we shape kind of the debate around these things, and how do we inform those as best we can with the information that's available, right? When you think about a think tank or especially a university, they're thinking about extending the frontier of human knowledge type of time horizon, right? And that's a very different exercise. I have friends we've had colleagues who've gone and done more of that type of work from after leaving our firm, and they'll spend a year cleaning a data set to be able to do the analysis to possibly be able to publish. And that's a time horizon that's kind of beyond the zone of debate that we work in.
I see. Now, you have a background in Republican administrations. You were in the George W. Bush White House and worked for Governor Schwarzenegger. Does Hamilton play strategies? Do you work to get folks from kind of both sides of the aisles? Tell me a little bit about kind of your sort of partisan positioning at your firm.
Yeah, it's split pretty evenly, I would say. We probably lean a little right among the partners or maybe the managing directors, and we lean a little left at the associate or analyst level. And part of that, to be honest, part of that is a function. It's probably the causation there is probably age. It's probably not it's probably not any particular partisan leanings type of stuff. But we try to have it be balanced in terms of how we do recruiting and the experience that people bring. I mean, we're in the business of getting things done and informing decisions. And if you only talk to one set of people, that just becomes much, much harder to do, right? And I think that it helps our work also. I mean, in the way that we scope our work in terms of not working on political campaigns, not working on social policy issues, most of the people who come in to our shop have some understanding of economics and some anchoring in business and how the world works and that sort of stuff. And so it's comparatively easier, I would say, within our walls for everybody to sync up, and at the same time have a little bit of a good difference of perspective on how to approach things to spice things up a little bit.
Yeah. And do a lot of folks, maybe compared to an intern class at a consulting firm, do a lot of folks tend to have more either experience, in government as like an intern in the Senate, or experience, doing more writing, like you mentioned before, working on the college newspaper? What sort of other experience are you looking for beyond, say, an economics degree?
Yeah, no, that's correct. You will. I don't know if you were involved in recruiting at McKinsey.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. I did some of that, and we have it's obviously different, but we have a pretty structured approach to that. We do resume scoring, and I think that on balance, what we try to do is we like to see an educational background that is fairly quantified, like has kind of a quantitative approach to things. A lot of times that's econ, though, engineering, math, statistics type of stuff mixes in there. And then we like to see people with backgrounds aside from that, that demonstrate an interest in the types of issues that we work on. So you'll see people who have interned at think tanks or interned on political campaigns or Capitol Hill, people who've worked in the media, that type of stuff. Yeah.
What would you say is, a great background or experience if someone wants to get into public policy and communications consulting, either they're in school, or even maybe just employed right now, but want to shift into your area? What sort of experience should people strive to get?
Well, the trick with our industry in some level is that it tends to be very volunteer driven, right? So the first thing, and I've had conversations over time with MBAs who are thinking about career switching, or I really want to kind of do, something in public policy, more mission oriented, whatever it may be. I think the challenge is that it can be difficult to break into what is fundamentally a pretty networked discipline, right? So you got to figure out some way to get into that type of work where you maybe have one foot on each base, right? So, if you have a background in finance, then you want to target things like Senate Banking Committee to be able to work on, or something like that, right? So you got to find a way, if you're trying to do a career shift in that zone, something like that is helpful. For people who are a little younger, there's usually opportunities to think about graduate school for something like that, either in law or master's in public administration, that type of thing. For undergrads, it's not actually that hard. It's kind of an exercise of, okay, go get involved, volunteer, figure out where you can kind of dive in. It's an industry. The thing to understand about it is that it's not it's not structured, so it's pretty easy to get in the door. On some level, it's very meritocratic or outcomes oriented when you're in the door, right? So it's very networked. So who you work with and who you work for matters. And that will kind of allow you to progress. It's also not very structured in terms of training. So you really do want to pay attention to mentors who know what they're doing and can show you the ropes, because you're not going to get onto a political campaign, as an example, and go through a week of training before doing your job. It's like, okay, here's your desk, go do this. See you later, right? Which is, people can thrive in that environment, but you have to kind of seek out the opportunities to learn from others, I would say.
You said it's a very network discipline. Could you just say a little bit more about that in terms of?
Well, as an example, like, have you? I don't know if you've heard of the coaching trees in the NFL. Are you a football guy?
No, I'm ignorant of that.
So there's a theory in football of what someone's coaching tree looks like, right? So if you go through, like, I'm a Pats fan, so Bill Belichick was defensive coordinator under Bill Parcells back in the day, right? So he would be part of, quote unquote, Bill Parcells' coaching tree. And one of the metrics for, or not metrics, but one of the way that people compare greatness of football coaches is like, okay, who is in your coaching tree? Basically, who were the people who were your head coordinators, offensive or defensive coordinator, and then went on to be head coaches in their own right. So you could imagine a scenario where you say, okay, this person in their coaching tree, they have so many championships or something like that, right? It's actually very similar in politics, is that people work in campaigns, especially. So people will work for different people, and then they'll kind of move on and take people with them, right? So like when I first came to Washington, I worked for Steve Schmidt, who, as people tend to know from television these days, but I worked for Steve at the NRCC, which is the Hill campaign committee for the Republicans. Steve went over to the Bush reelect, and I went and worked for Steve on the Bush reelect. And then Steve managed Schwarzenegger campaign, and I worked for Governor Schwarzenegger. And then Steve worked for John McCain, and I worked for him on that, right? Matt Rhodes worked for Steve Schmidt on the Bush campaign, and then Matt was the campaign manager for the Romney campaign. So it's a very networked environment where who you work for, the training you get is very on the job. So people assume things that you know based on who you worked for at a particular point in time. So that's kind of it. And and the job fillings on campaigns and that sort of stuff, it tends to be referral based stuff. It's very heavily networked. So it's like, okay, I need someone for this role. Do you know anyone good? Great. Tell them to be in the office on Monday. I mean, that's kind of the level of speed that these things work on. So it's an interesting discipline. And like part of what we've tried to do in our firm is really combine some of the tactical and speed elements of that world with kind of the discipline, the knowledge, and the depth of consulting, and how can you combine those two to be able to move very quickly and impact debates as they roll along.
Wow. Well, Matt, this has been an extraordinarily fascinating tour of the public policy and communications consulting world for me. So folks who want to find out more about Hamilton Place Strategies, we'll definitely include your website in the show notes. Any other links or Twitter handles that you'd like to share?
Yeah, my Twitter handle is Matt McD HPS, and HPS is also on. We also do a podcast, the HPS Macrocast, and HPS Insight. So I'll have to return the favor here shortly.
All right, so we'll include those links in the show notes. Matt, this has been really, really informative to me. Really enjoyed speaking with you. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Well, thanks a lot.